Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we're going to be taking a look at the discography of the Armenian metal band System of a Down, one of the great metal bands of the past 25 years in my opinion, and as somebody who was born in 1990, System of a Down was a huge part of my childhood. From the moment I heard them, I was immediately intrigued by their very unique sound. Between Serj Tankian's very distinct and dynamic vocal work, Daron Malakian's super interesting guitar work, the political subject matters that they would write about in their lyrics, and just their overall very rhythmic and very unorthodox approach to writing metal music, which I think made them a breath of fresh air for the late 90s and the early 2000s, and I consider them to be one of the most unique and consistent metal bands of their era, and their input has been timeless and invaluable. And although they have a pretty small discography with only 5 studio albums, this is a group that did not release a bad record in my opinion, and because of that, this was definitely one of the tougher discographies for me to rank. But after some careful thought and some repeated listens, I have arrived at my definitive ranking, and what I'm going to do is go through their 5 studio albums, starting with System of a Down and going up to Hypnotize, and I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Okay, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1998, which is a self-titled album, System of a Down, and I'm going to give this one an A. I know I'm going to piss some people off right off the bat with this scoring. A lot of people regard this as their best album, and I can certainly understand why it resonates that much with so many people, because it's certainly an amazing record. But for me personally, they do have other albums that I resonate with a little bit more, but regardless of that, this is obviously still a very strong debut record, and I think it's perfectly valid for people to regard this as their best album. I think it's a great introduction to the very unique sound that is System of a Down. We get a great selection of 13 tracks that showcase all of the different sides of their songwriting, with the hard-hitting and sometimes very unorthodox guitar parts, the awesome mixture of Serj's heavier screaming vocals, as well as his more melodic sensibilities on tracks like Spiders. We have the intricate rhythmic parts between the guitars, drums, and vocals on tracks like Soil. We have the humorous and very quirky and unexpected changes in feels, which is another staple of the System of a Down sound and part of what makes their music so unique and unorthodox, and we hear that on songs like No, Sugar, Qbert, and Pluck, which all have lots of twists and turns and unexpected drum grooves that create some really interesting detours and really keep the listener on the edge of their seat. Production-wise, we have Rick Rubin in the driver's seat, and he would produce all of the studio records of System of a Down, and I think that was a magical pairing. And lyrically, we have a lot of intense social, historical, and political subject matters covered, ranging from religious extremism, pedophilia in the church, anti-war sentiments, and the Armenian genocide on the closing track Pluck, which is something that is very close to home with Serj, as his 4 grandparents were all survivors of that horrific period in history. As far as some of my favorite tracks go, I do tend to resonate a bit more with the first half of the album. Pretty much all of my favorite songs on here happen between the first 6 to 7 tracks. I absolutely love the way it opens up with Sweet Pea. Right from the opening notes, it just hits us with a very unique guitar sound with these alternating harmonics, and then it goes into this hard-hitting groove that kickstarts this album beautifully with a really great drive and intensity to it. As far as other favorites from the first half of the record would go, my number one favorite track on here would have to be Spiders. Just an absolutely beautiful melodic metal track that is, in my opinion, the standout song from this record by far. My other 2 favorites from the first half would have to be Suggestions and Soil. I love the eerie mood of Suggestions. I like how they incorporate the acoustic guitar on certain sections, creating some really nice contrast in the instrumentation. And Soil has some super badass guitar parts, and I love the odd time signature where it alternates between 7/8 and 4/4. I do still think the second half of the album is really good, but I wouldn't say tracks 8 to 13 would be any of my favorite songs from this record. But as far as my favorites from the second half of the album go, I would have to go with War, Peephole, and Pluck, which I think is the high point of the second half of the record, and it's a very intense and powerful closer to this very solid debut record. So although I'm putting this in A tier rather than S, that certainly does not mean that this is not a great album. Like I said at the beginning, I just find myself resonating with with the songwriting and the styles on some of the other records a little bit more than this one, but regardless of that, this is certainly a very good debut record that contains all of the flavors of the System of a Down sound and has a really great selection of tracks and is an awesome record to introduce the listener to this very unique band. So a very good first album, but not my favorite of theirs, so this one will get an A. Alright, next we have their second studio album from 2001 titled Toxicity, and obviously this one gets an S, probably not a huge surprise to anybody. This is a legendary early 2000s metal record and would easily be my favorite System of a Down album. I know it's a cliche choice, but this album is just so consistent from front to back, and as far as early 2000s metal goes, I think this album is easily one of the best of that genre to come out of that period. The album is 15 tracks long and features a very dynamic selection of tracks that are very unique both musically and lyrically, showcasing every side of the System of a Down sound with tons of heavy, badass, hard-hitting tracks, but also moments that can be comical, sad, hopeful, and everything in between, with Serj writing about a lot of political topics that didn't seem to be as prevalent in the mainstream discussions at that time, with topics like mass incarceration, police brutality, the destruction of the environment, and drug addiction, among other topics. And I think the inclusion of all of these different subjects in their lyrics really shows how ahead of the curve System of a Down was in terms of political awareness and really diving into a wide array of subjects that have eventually become a main part of the political zeitgeist. And for me, this was the first System of a Down album that I heard when I was in middle school, and it features arguably their three biggest hits with Chop Suey, Aerials, and Toxicity. All are absolutely perfect metal songs that are all unique in their own regard. Chop Suey was the first System of a Down song that I ever heard, and I have very vivid memories of seeing that music video for the first time and just being completely intrigued by the very unorthodox sound of this band and really just wanting to dive in and check out all of their music. And I think that song is really the perfect introduction to somebody who wants to explore System of a Down and their unique style of songwriting. It's a great showcase for Daron's very cool and rhythmic guitar writing, as well as showing all of the different sides of Serj's vocal work between the fast, aggressive rhythmic parts, as well as the heavier screaming side, but also the more melodic side of his voice. And I absolutely love the final section of this song when they introduce the piano. That part always gives me chills and is, in my opinion, one of the great musical moments of any System of a Down track. Toxicity is an equally incredible track, doing commentary on the destruction of the environment, and Aerials is, of course, another incredible and classic System of a Down hit. And while these three hits do resemble some of the highest points of this record, the remaining 12 tracks can certainly keep up with them, and I don't think there is a bad song throughout this track listing. Prison Song is probably my favorite opening track of any of their records. Again, just such a unique song with so many layers to it, with Serj shouting out different prison statistics in between some very heavy sections and some vocal work from Daron, a nice call and response. And I think it is the perfect song to kick things off and really bring the listener in. Some other standout tracks for me would be Psycho, Bounce, Shimmy, and Atwa, which creates some nice mellow contrast to the more heavy and hard-hitting tracks, at least in the verse of that song. And I also really love the way the album closes with Arto, which is based on an Armenian church hymn and features some very colorful and exotic instrumentations, which concludes this album on a beautiful mood that is very authentic to the influence and culture of System of a Down. And I think they took everything that they had established on their previous record and enhanced it even further with some of the most classic hits of their discography, as well as some of their strongest B-sides. And if I was to make a list of my top 10 favorite System of a Down tracks, this album would have at least 5 songs that would make that list, which is more than any of their other records, and that is why it goes down as my number 1 favorite album of their discography, and a record that will always be seriously nostalgic for me and a timeless metal record to come out of the early 2000s. So probably not a huge surprise to anybody, this one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their third studio album from 2002 titled Steal This Album. And this is probably going to surprise some people, but I'm actually going to give this one an S. I think this album is absolutely amazing. A lot of System of a Down fans seem to be pretty divided on this record. I know a lot of people regard this as their worst album and basically just, categorize it as the leftover B-sides and outtakes from Toxicity, and I completely disagree with that. I think the quality of the songwriting on this is very strong. I will grant that the songs are of a shorter length than anything on Toxicity and Self-Titled, but that's not something I've ever taken issue with when I listen to this record, and for a 16-song track listing, I think it is incredibly consistent. It only has one or two songs that I could do without, but I think the overall quality of the songs on here is definitely on par with Toxicity. I will say it doesn't have as many standout hits as Toxicity, but I think Toxicity is an almost impossible album to follow, and I think they did about as good of a job as they could have done on here. I love the way it opens up with Chick and Stew, starting the album out on a more comical note with a song about pizza, and it's a nice contrast from the opener of Toxicity, which was very politically charged with Prison Song. And from that point on, I think it delivers one amazing track after the next, offering again every side of what System of a Down has to offer, with awesome guitar riffs, heavy hard-hitting vocal parts, catchy choruses, comical moments, and we still get plenty of serious political commentary like we heard on the previous record on tracks like Boom, which was a protest song against the war in Iraq. For the first half of the album, my favorite songs would be Inner Vision, New Guns, and IEAIAIO. And for the second half, my favorites would be Pictures, Highway Song, Ego Brain, and Streamline, which might be my favorite closing track of any System of a Down record. I love the odd meter riff in 5, and it's just a super hard-hitting and very interesting track to conclude this great album with. And Ego Brain is another standout moment from this album for me. That's a track that I consider to be one of the more underrated System of a Down songs, and one of the high points of the second half of the record. So I will grant you that this record did not produce any groundbreaking, iconic System of a Down songs like Chop Suey or Toxicity, but for a follow-up to an almost impossible to follow album, I think they did a great job of delivering another very solid batch of tracks that I still think are of very high quality and are incredibly consistent from front to back, with every sound that you want to hear from System of a Down, and a good handful of tracks that I would regard as some of the best songs of their discography. They might not all make my top 10 list, but there are definitely plenty of songs on here that would easily make my top 15 and top 20 favorite System of a Down track list. So a very good album, one that I think is much better than some people give it credit for. This one gets an S. Okay, next we have their fourth studio album from 2005 titled Mesmerize, and I will also give this an S. I absolutely love this record. This one goes down as my second favorite System of a Down album. I think it's an even further improvement upon what they did on Steal This Album, and a record that I do think can give Toxicity a run for its money. This album is 11 tracks long, and it features an incredible lineup of songs that are all very dynamic and do a great job of incorporating all of those different flavors of their sound, which results in a very consistent track listing that has lots of nice variety from song to song. It spawned the classic hit BYOB, which is an exceptional System of a Down song and the perfect track to kickstart the album after the intro. And from that point on, they hit us with 9 more amazing songs with plenty of heavier tracks, with some of those energetic, fast rhythmic vocal parts and guitar riffs on songs like Revenga, This Cocaine Makes Me Feel Like I'm on This Song, and Violent Pornography. We have some songs that alternate very nicely between clean guitars and heavier sections with more aggressive vocals on tracks like Radio/Video, Sad Statue, the beautiful closing track Lost in Hollywood, and Question, which is a cool track that has a groove in 5. And Question, Lost in Hollywood, and BYOB would probably be my 3 favorites from this record. I also think in terms of the different palette of sounds that the guitars offer on here, I think it is some of my favorite guitar work from Darren of any System of a Down record, and also vocally, I think Serj is on top of his game, and it also features some of my favorite Serj and Darren vocal harmonies of any System of a Down record, and I just do not think there is one skip over track throughout any of this. Every song is unique in its own regard, and it always has some sort of surprising element that catches you off guard and really keeps you on the edge of your seat. And after putting out 3 amazing records prior to this one, it's really mind-blowing that they are still managing to come up with new sounds and new interesting and exotic parts, and it resulted in an album that sounds very fresh and refined and goes down as my second favorite System of a Down record. So I absolutely love this album. This is another one that gets an easy S. Alright, and lastly, we have their fifth and most recent studio album from 2005 titled Hypnotize, and I will give this an A. I think this is a very good album, but I do think it is a bit of a downgrade from Mesmerize, and if I had to pick a least favorite System of a Down record, I would go with this one. But don't get the wrong impression, this is still an awesome album, and when you're ranking a discography of a band that really has no bad records, it does make it hard to call any album your least favorite because there does seem to be some sort of negative implications in that statement. But regardless of the fact that this is my least favorite record of theirs, I still think it is a very strong album. This album and Mesmerize were initially meant to be a double album, but they decided to split them up into two individual albums, and it sounds very much like a continuation of what they did on Mesmerize. The main difference for me personally would be that I think Mesmerize is more consistent from front to back and also has more songs that I find really stand out and exceptional. This album certainly has its fair share of incredible songs, but there are a few tracks here and there that I think are okay, but I wouldn't say are some of the strongest System of a Down tracks in the grand scheme of their discography, and that is why I bumped it down one tier and do consider it their weakest album. This record is 12 tracks long, and the way I generally feel about this album is that I think it starts and ends very strong, and I think the middle of it is fairly strong, but I would regard that as the weaker part of the album, and the spot that has some of the tracks that I would regard as their least exciting songs. Out of the opening 4 tracks of the album, my 2 favorites would be Kill Rock and Roll and the title track Hypnotize. I love the harmonies and the trade-offs between Serj and Daron on Kill Rock and Roll, and we hear a lot of that throughout this record, and I would say of the 5 System of a Down albums, Daron's vocals are probably featured in the most prevalent role on this album, and that's something that I do enjoy, and Hypnotize would be one of the big hits to come from this record. Obviously, it goes without saying that that is a classic System of a Down song, and another one with similar interplay between Serj and Daron. Then when we get from track 5 to track 8, the midpoint of the record, this is where I do think it loses a little bit of steam, and it has a couple of tracks that I wouldn't say I dislike, but I just don't think they are some of the best songs that System of a Down has written, with tracks like Stealing Society and You Fig. I do, however, love Tentative and Holy Mountains. I particularly love the guitar work on Tentative, and Holy Mountains has some very catchy and melodic vocal parts. Then when we get to the last third of the album, from track 9 to 12, I do think it picks up a lot in momentum. Vicinity of Obscenity gives us those classic, quirky, and very rhythmically complex System of a Down vibes with lots of style changes, which adds some elements of humor to the vibe. She's Like Heroin is a very ominous and eerie sounding track that I really love. And believe it or not, this is actually one of my favorite songs from this album. I don't know what it is, but I just love the vibe that this song creates. And another one where Daron is in the driver's seat with the vocals. And obviously, Lonely Day is the big hit to come from this record, and I would say it is hands down the strongest song on here. An absolutely beautiful melodic metal song that is one of the most classic tracks to come from the later period of the System of a Down discography. And Soldier Side is a solid closer, but if I had to rank the 5 closing tracks of each of their records, this would probably be my least favorite, but still a solid song regardless. I would say about 85% of this record is great. I don't know if I would say any of the tracks are bad on here, but if I'm comparing them to songs from the other albums, I do think some of the tracks on here don't reach the same highs that the tracks on the other records do, and those are my main reasons as to why I would consider it my least favorite record. But like I said, it's still very strong regardless. It's got a good handful of very exceptional tracks, and I think it's a solid final release up to this point. So this one gets an A. Alright, so those are my takes on System of a Down's 5 studio records to date. It's really remarkable how much incredible music they put out in such a short period of time, and unfortunately we've gotten very little music from them since the Hypnotize album. They've been on hiatus for most of the time since the release of that record, but they did link back up in 2020 and release 2 singles to raise awareness to what was happening in Armenia and raise funds for people affected by the war. But other than that, there's really no telling what the future holds for System of a Down. They have done some shows over the past couple of years, which is a very promising thing, but as far as them ever releasing a new album goes, that still remains to be pretty unclear. But if they were to eventually release another studio album, I'm willing to bet that it would be very awesome from a musical perspective, but it also would probably offer a lot of great insights into the political climate that we are currently living in. But regardless, if we ever hear from this band again, I think all 5 of these albums will forever be timeless, and for anybody who grew up in the same decade as myself, I'm sure System of a Down was a huge part of your childhood, and they are one of the few groups that I can say does not have a bad album in their discography, and I'm glad to have covered them for today's episode. So thank you so much for watching. I hope it was enjoyable, and if you are interested, please feel free to check out some of my other tier lists linked in the comments and the description and see if there's anything else that you might like. And like I said, please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments, where you agree and disagree, and how you would rank these 5 albums. I would love to hear your thoughts. Alright, that is it for today. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Take care.